Welcome, everybody, to tonight's Fireside Chat, hosted by the Stern School's Fubon Center for Technology, Business, and Innovation here at NYU. I'm Foster Provost, and tonight we have the next installment of our Demystifying AI series. If you haven't seen the prior installments, just go to Google and Google my name and YouTube, and they should be on the first page of results. So tonight, we're going to have an examination of AI in the creative professions. As I wrote in the blurb for the chat tonight, creative professionals are terrified by AI. The president of the Society of Composers and Lyricists wrote, and I quote, "The rapid introduction of generative AI systems is seen as an existential threat to the livelihood and continuance of our creative professions. We've also seen AI at the center of the contract disputes for the actors and the writers in Hollywood. And as the music industry is always on the cutting edge of what happens with technology, I'm delighted to introduce our guest for the evening. So Howie Singer has been immersed in the technological transformations of the music industry for decades. He worked for 15 years at Warner Music, serving as SVP and as a chief strategic technologist. He's been a strategic consultant to Universal Music. He was co-founder of A to B Music, which is a pioneering music startup, and more. He currently advises music companies on the implications of generative AI. I got to know Howie because he teaches a class here on data analytics for the music music industry in NYU's music business program. And I want to mention that Howie is the author of the new book, Key Changes. The 10 times technology transformed the music industry. If you're interested in technology in the music industry at all, you definitely have to get this book. And in fact, if you're interested in either the music industry or how technology transforms business, you should get this book. It's I knew a good bit about a lot of these topics, and I learned something on every page, I think. So welcome, Howie.
Thanks, and I think I owe you a commission now for that wonderful support of the book. Appreciate it greatly, and glad to be here. You know, when I told my wife, well, I'm doing a fireside chat with the business school, then she says, well, what is it about? I said, well, guess. And she said, AI, because that's all anybody seems to want to talk about these days.
Cool. So before we talk about AI, I wanted to, your book really highlights how the music industry seems to be on the leading edge of business transformation just about every time we have a technology revolution, with like Napster and iTunes being only the obvious example.
Right. And there are others. The technology that drove the music industry to its highest heights ever, although today's revenues exceed the revenues in 1999 when the industry was at its peak with the CD. It is worth noting that with inflation, we haven't yet achieved the peak if we equalize the numbers for inflation. But even when the CD was introduced, the product that drove the industry to its most profitable days, where they can afford all sorts of drugs and wrecked hotel rooms, by artists. When it was first introduced, Sony was all for it. The first commercial CD introduced was a Billy Joel record in Japan. Philips was all for it because they collaborated on the invention. But the other music companies were not convinced, and they actually had to create a team of people to go around and pitch the product to the labels to convince them that it would be worthwhile to introduce their music on this new format that people didn't really understand. So it's always been the case, in part, like every other business, it's the innovator's dilemma. When you have a profitable business, it's hard to be persuaded you should leap to the next thing. And that was true for CDs. It was true for MTV, certainly true for Napster and digital, which, the very first time I was in one of the big music industry conference rooms and we pitched them on sending music over networks and selling music over networks, we were almost thrown out of the room.
All right. So tonight's about AI. I'm sure we might go back to some other lessons, through the, as we go along. But let's talk a little bit about AI. And by the way, I just want to mention to everybody, normally we have Q&A at the end. And I would suggest that as you have questions as we go along, put them into the Q&A tab. And I will try my best to keep peeking at that while we go and not get too distracted. And if something is relevant right at the time, I might bring it up. I may also have it slotted for later in the, in the plan. But that would be, that'd be great if you put your questions in the Q&A. Okay, so people are mostly probably thinking about AI now as modern AI and the largely generative large models. But and that's what we'll spend most of our time talking about, I think, right? But maybe talk a little bit about AI that's not these generative AI systems in the music industry, and is it a threat to the creative professionals, or is it something we can move past and get right onto the generative AI?
No, I think it's worth talking about the opportunities that it's already created because it's broadly used. If you're the data analyst team at one of the labels and you're trying to look at the signals that might indicate future success, an artist who's got very rapidly growing Instagram audience, or has a TikTok video that is highlighting a particular song. All of those kinds of signals are fed into predictive models that identify the future growth for this particular artist. And those models have been used for several years. In fact, some companies that built them got acquired by the labels to bring an acqui-hire, to bring that expertise in-house. So, there's one example. If we want to look at the DSPs, the digital service providers, the streamers who do music, let's use Spotify as the largest example here in the US. Their Discover Weekly playlist is based on AI models that look at consumption patterns, collaborative filtering, all kinds of things to come up with the best flavor of the playlist for you that will keep you engaged, that will keep you listening, and most importantly, keep you from churning and leaving the service and going to Apple Music or Amazon Music instead. Yet one other example on the production side, mastering records is expensive. If you're a big artist, you can afford a lot of money. Independent artists, maybe not so much. There are tools. One is called Lander, Landr, that analyzed how mastering engineers work and then created a software tool that was inexpensive for people to use to master their records. Is it as good as the very best mastering engineers? No, but you don't have to pay for that very best mastering engineer. So there are lots of examples where adoption has been fairly rapid and has become part of the business processes that labels and artists already use.
So what's different than now, and why are the creative professionals so terrified?
I think it's all about substitution, right? The concern is that we're going to be able to, we already can train models that imitate the voice of a particular singer. You mentioned in your introduction that this was at the heart of the strike between first the writers and then the actors with the studios, right? The studios wanted to be able to scan actors' faces and create digital extras, which they already do to some degree, right? The crowd scenes in, an arena are not real actors. They're generated using CGI and models, but they wanted to make them specific to particular people and then use that material without necessarily paying the artist or compensating them for that use. Supposedly that's now part of the settlement that they have, but it's this substitution issue that the generative AI, and there are lots of aspects to this, the voice and the singer. Let's stick with music for the moment. It could be the instrumentation and the accompaniment to the music. It could be the lyrics. So all those pieces, people are trying to create new things based on old things. And the fear is that that will displace the opportunity for the original artist or the original actor or the original writer. We haven't talked about writers yet, but they're busy suing generative AI companies as well.
So let's talk about hopefully we will have time to talk about all of these different things. I thought we might start with the voice, because that seems, in the music industry, that seems to be really at the fore right now. And as you mentioned, it's very similar to the main concerns, not all the concerns, but the main concerns in the actors recently recently contracted actors strike. So yeah, tell us a little about what's going on now with, I don't know that if people even know what's going on with the voice.
Well, there was a lot of press.
Jacking.
Yeah, voice jacking is a phrase I heard an artist use, which is certainly a judgmental phrase that without their permission, without their consent, and most importantly, without any compensation, that people were creating synthetic voices that were based on their vocal style. And it is worth noting, there isn't a copyright in federal law about an individual person's voice, right? So, and if you think about where this technology is going to be misused, it's going to be a problem for our election. We're going to have fake voices of Biden and Trump both saying things that they might not have said otherwise. And obviously, imitating a spoken voice, a synthetic spoken voice, is somewhat simpler than a singing voice. But again, you can find lots of examples already of, an imitation Johnny Cash or so on. And the issue is this being done in a way that compensates me? There are artists who are very much in favor of this, and they've already announced a business model to do it. Holly Herndon, for example, is an artist who has created something she calls Holly Plus. It is a synthetic version of her voice. It's trained on her material. She did it herself. She tuned the model. If you search for Holly Herndon or Holly Plus on the web and the song Jolene, the Dolly Parton song, you can hear Holly Plus sing it. It's a quite good imitation of her. If you decide to use that voice model and create something, she's said you can do it, but here's the financial model that's going to share the rewards of that together. However, there are other people saying, well, we're just training on publicly available material. We don't need to ask permission.
Let's talk about the voice. Talk about this issue. Let's dig down a little into it, because again, it seems to be like a lot of people that I've talked to about the artist strike in Hollywood are like, well, pretty clearly you shouldn't get to just use that person's likeness, and so that seems to be one of the least controversial issues. And the voice, I didn't say uncontroversial, one of the least controversial issues. And the voices in music seems to be the direct analog of that. But on the other hand, just because I don't want somebody to do something, or we all think maybe that doesn't sound right, it's not clear that, be too bad for you, someone else might say, right?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm an engineer by training, but I've had to learn way more about copyright law than I ever thought I would need to in the job that I had at Warner Music. And there isn't strong federal law on this issue. There are state laws, and perhaps the most famous case related to this had nothing to do with artificial intelligence. It was decades ago when I think it was Ford Motor Company wanted to create a commercial using a Bette Midler song. And they made her an offer to pay her to use her music, and she said no, her right not to participate in that commercial. And then they proceeded to hire a sound-alike to sing a song identified with Bette Midler in a voice that sounded like Bette Midler, and she won that case because they were in California, though it was a state law case, not a federal copyright case. She won that case because they were clearly taking advantage of her vocal style and imitating her and substituting for what they would have paid her, and she had the right to refuse. But there's no law like that across all states. And in fact, the head of Universal Music already showed up in Congress saying, we need a law that covers this kind of thing. So it is uniform across the whole country. And I think you're right. People's impression is if I train a text model on all the writings of Stephen King, and then write, create a new work that is based on that, the equivalent of fan fiction that people do today. But in this case, it's a much smarter version of that fan fiction done with an AI model, that Stephen King ought to be compensated for that. And he ought to be able to give permission to allow that kind of thing to occur.
So wait a minute, though, because this seems to be taking another step, right? So, the first was my likeness or my voice, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that's equivalent to my likeness, with the California case seeming to provide some support and people's general reactions, seeming to, right? And that's a case where, in a sense, it doesn't matter what data you use to train the thing. The issue seems to be the co-opting of the likeness, right?
Or the vocal likeness, if we want
or
to
the
call
vocal
it that.
or the vocal likeness, right? If we're talking about writing in the style of, right, it's unclear to me that I would have the same reaction to, like, you take my face and you put it on a character just because I'm such a popular professor that everyone wants to see me in movies, right? I don't know. I think maybe I should be compensated for that. But, like, teaching in the style of Foster, like, I don't know that I would really have all that much ground to stand on to basically be like, wait a minute, right? I mean, and we'll get to the training data in a minute, but let's just say simply the co-opting of the style. I mean, do you feel there's a general idea, a general feeling that that's something that ought to be protected by law?
I don't think there's a general feeling about it. There's a dispute about it, just like there's going to be for all these issues. When we talk about how long it takes to resolve these things, I think there are lessons in history. It took 30 years after the introduction of the phonograph before there was protection, copyright protection for, making those copies on cylinders or discs. It takes a long time. 10 years after Napster launched was when the last file sharing service was found to be infringing. LimeWire in particular was the final one. And it took a decade between the launch. Napster got shut down relatively quickly. Less than 2 years, Napster was gone, but then there were all its successors. So these things take a long time. And I expect we're going to see the same thing on this AI front. We have suits by writers, again, overtraining material, but also imitating the style on the output side. And, people say, well, if you can't find remnants of the copyrighted works in the output, all's fair, right? That's part of the argument. But it is clear that the creative community, whether it's writers or graphic artists suing Midjourney and some of the models that draw pictures in the style of, pick your graphic artist, there are lawsuits in all these areas, and we're going to see rulings come down on both sides. And it wouldn't be surprising if in 8 years, if we repeat this session, we're going to be talking about a Supreme Court case on these issues.
So, by the way, as a clarification, one of our participants asks, why wouldn't the entertainment providers simply choose to pay royalties for using the likeness of of whomever, right? So to avoid the legal expenses and trouble and all that.
We're going to talk about some of the comments that were written. The Copyright Office has done a bunch of listening sessions that I participated in. But they also asked for comments on copyright and AI issues. And just to pick one specific party that said the reason why they didn't want to pay, Andreessen Horowitz, the big venture capital firm, said that they've assumed, rightly or wrongly, they've assumed that the copyright regime that they have and the kinds of things that were covered by Google Books will apply here. And these are transformative uses, which is a key factor in fair use. We can get to that in a minute. But they believe that they were operating under a set of rules they understood to be true. And now, if you change those rules, it's going to undermine all their investments and, hurt innovation in the United States when it's trying to compete with China. So, it is always better not to pay for your raw materials if you have a choice, right? In any business.
I guess our commenters point was, but you have to pay anyway if there's going to be all manner of legal trouble, right?
Right.
Okay, so one other thing on the copying, once it gets past the direct likeness or voice or something like that, it seems like art over the history of art has to do with somebody coming along and doing something different. I'm the first impressionist painter. And then a whole bunch of people jumping in and doing something that, especially right at the time, would be like, no, you're just doing exactly what that person did, right? But then now, as we look back, we see all these different impressionist painters as being substantively different. The Stones came out and everyone's like, oh, come on, they're Beatles ripoffs. Springsteen came out and they said, oh, he's a Dylan, ripoff, right? And over and over and over again.
And then John Cougar Mellencamp copied Bruce.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I mean, it just keeps going on. Coldplay was a U2 ripoff. But then, after the fact, you're like, no, they're actually amazing artists in their own right. And, just because they were stylistically similar, we didn't, so anyway, is there something special here that goes beyond just the fact that, like, yeah, well, I mean, some art is essentially derivative of other art.
Right. I think this is sort of going to be one of the key questions that is going to be part of these cases, right? If you or I have an NYU student here today who is a rabid fan of Olivia Rodrigo, and they sit in their dorm room for the next month, just absorbing every piece of music she's written, her new record, which is doing well, listening to all of it. And at the end of that month, they write a song that has been inspired by what they've been listening to. And it doesn't copy any specific elements. It doesn't reuse lyrics, but that individual has learned from the person that has come before, right? And that's been the case. There have been lots of cases where people copied elements or even copied a vibe of a song. There are cases like that have gone to court saying it's an infringement because it takes too much of the vibe of this Marvin Gaye song or whatever. We have a legal regime and a methodology to analyze those things. Is it any different if an AI model does exactly what we just said this, student of ours is doing in their dorm room? And the creative community says, well, yes, it is, right? It's a difference in scale in terms on both ends, right? That model could create thousands of versions, right? And maybe many of them stink, but maybe one of them is really good, and no human being could create as much. So it is different in that aspect. I've heard that from some writers specifically. And we may agree with that statement or not. I'm just putting forward the position that people are taking. And the second part is that student who was listening there's no way they could remember as many attributes, as many factors, as many variables as an AI can do on let's pick a bigger corpus of work than Olivia Rodrigo, who's, maybe great, but has a limited catalog. Let's use the Beach Boys or Prince, an enormous collection of works that, yes, you could listen to them, but you couldn't necessarily do what the AI can do in terms of using all those aspects, even if they're not copying specific elements. But it is clear that's going to be the argument. If you can't find specific copy pieces, I'm all clear, that the AI model people will say. And the creator community will say, well, no, actually, you're doing something that is different from what a human being is doing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just because part of my role is to play devil's advocate, it's basically, technologies do transform industries. And so Absolutely. It's like, oh, the mechanical loom comes along, and that's not fair because it works it can do things at much larger scale, than the hand weavers, or the big combine tractor comes along, and so there seems to be, I think these things need to be disentangled. What things are really, I guess, infringing on some right that people have, and which ones aren't? And I suppose it's a topic for another chat, and whether you have a right to actually do your job without a machine coming along and, go read, if you haven't read them, everybody, if you haven't read The Grapes of Wrath, go read The Grapes of Wrath.
But your introductory comment from the composers was this is an existential threat. And I think this is the reason they feel that it is, right? There's the old metaphor of, send the million monkeys at typewriters and eventually you'll get, the Hamlet out of it with all that. And of course, you really don't. And the numbers are so astronomical. But here we have a very smart set of monkeys, these AI learning models who can do much better in learning from what Shakespeare has written before to go do something else. And, that is in the same vein. And, as of yet, we haven't had any of those great creative works. I know we call it generative AI, but in some sense it's regenerative, right? It's taking what it's learned from what's come in the past. And that is what artists do, right? They say, isn't the line, great artists, artists
Steal.
Copy and great artists steal, right? I mean, that is the quote. Right. So it isn't something that hasn't come before, that the industry hasn't faced, but it is going to be the sort of the nub of this issue is going to be the, one of the big fights that's coming.
Yeah. So given the time, I would like to actually now, I told you I didn't want to before, but move on and include the discussion of training, because that seems to be the second major aspect of it. So how does the fact that at least as pretty much everything I've read about this assumes that the reason that these systems can do what they do is because they've been trained on the work of the creative professional who would be upset about it, right?
Right.
So how does that? Yeah. So what are the issues now that adds?
Yeah. And I think it's. I know you want to focus on the input side and the training, but it's hard to tease it out from the output side.
Because no. I just want to bring that training into the discussion now, but I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's hard to separate. So there is a case already. The only music related case that's been filed so far was against Anthropic, which is a company that the music companies are saying, the music publishers, the owners of the rights to the lyrics, say that this model trained on our lyrics without permission. And if you look at the court filing, it has many examples of the output being virtually identical to the lyrics. And it isn't even where you would prompt the system to say, give me the lyrics to Promised Land from Bruce Springsteen. They actually said, give me a song about the death of Buddy Holly. And what came out were lyrics that were substantially the same as American Pie, right? So they're saying, obviously, you trained on these lyrics because the model can recreate them. Yes. And,
I mean, in those specific cases, I think it is, I would certainly agree. Actually, again, I didn't mean to be saying I didn't think they were training on it, right? It's just that, like in many cases, we can't tell. In those cases, you definitely can tell. And so, so what are the issues? But
let me also add in one of the cases where we've had some rulings already, the judge said, but it was a writing case, and they didn't reproduce the writings of the author, so they said, I can't see it, so I'm throwing out some of these claims you've made about them training on your written material because I can't see it in the outputs.
Right. But I mean, it's in the American Pie case. I mean, if they went out and made that song, then they would be infringing on copyright. So we already would have a regime that would actually deal with that, right? So what are the specific?
But the argument is that if the outputs are there, therefore you trained on it, and if you trained on it without my permission, it clearly wasn't, quote, publicly available data. You were using a data set, and in many cases, there are big data sets of books or big data sets of images, big data sets of lyrics. Those lyrics, even if they were licensed by the publishers, were not licensed for this purpose. They were not licensed with you getting the right to create derivative works that are based on those lyrics. And so that's going to be the argument they make in court. We'll see if it holds up. We're just we're just at the beginning of that case. And as
So
I
how
said,
does
this
this
thing's been
relate to,
years.
for example, when Google, right, introduced Google Books, right? And those, so weren't there similar questions that arose at the beginning there that, like, wait a minute, you're basically going in and you're using all this
Right.
copyrighted material for a purpose other than the purpose for which you
Right.
had got.
So the legal doctrine here is fair use, which is not a right, it's a defense to a copyright infringement claim. And there are 4 factors that constitute fair use. One of them is that, was I transforming? Is the use transformative? And that was what Google Books ultimately won on, is that, yes, we ingested all these books, but then we transformed them into these snippets that were there not to compete with the original work, the original book, but to help researchers, to help you find things, to provide summaries, and the court ruled that it was indeed transformative. And I think that's going to be one of the elements here in the case. But there is another factor. We don't have to go through all 4, and I'm not sure I could remember them because, again, I'm not a lawyer. But one of the other factors is the market effect of the output, is the thing that you're creating competing with the original. And I think that's where the writers, the graphic artists, the musicians are going to say, well, wait, if you're creating works that build on my style of any sort, writing, art, music, that ultimately can compete with what I create on my own, you're hurting my market potential. Let's just stick with music for a second. Many of the examples on the voice side or the others, they say they're fakes, right? They're not trying to purport to be anything other than an imitation. But if I had a model that could create Olivia Rodrigo-like songs, and I submitted that to Spotify, it would get analyzed to determine many of the characteristics of that song. And guess what? It would end up getting placed on playlists with songs by Olivia Rodrigo, just by the nature of how they do their job and analyze the material that gets uploaded to the service. So if there were a playlist that had a bunch of Olivia Rodrigo songs and a synthetic Olivia Rodrigo song, given the way they calculate the money, that synthetic song would be competing in the marketplace and drawing royalties away from the genuine stuff. So the market impact of these AI versions could be negative for the original creators, the writers, the artists, the singers.
Do they have to show that? Because, I mean, it also could be that none of these songs is good enough for it ever to get any substantive economic value away. And secondly, it might actually net add to the, I mean, we've seen that kind of thing many times as well.
I don't like being the naysayer, because I can think of all these great uses for the technology, right? I mean, it is already the case, and you may think it's a little creepy, but you can go see a concert of a Roy Orbison hologram, right? Now, his family has authorized that. It sounds a bit creepy, perhaps, but when you think again about how people learn about artists who aren't with us anymore, having a duet of Roy Orbison with Morgan Wallen, the biggest country artist of the past year, might inform fans who never heard of Roy Orbison that they ought to go listen to him. And that could be a positive. The question is, for me, is it being done with permission? Is it being authorized by his estate, which was the case for these holograms? So I can think of some great uses for these synthetic voices, for helping artists to create lyrics. You write songs, Foster. I know you would like to have a tool that help you write better songs, and give you ideas when you're stuck on the bridge, perhaps. So there's lots of positive uses. The question is, were those models built with compensation for the material that they used and with permission?
So two technical questions. The first, I don't know whether you know the answer to this, but it's just something I've wondered here, because let's just say that I decide I want to make a recording of Pretty Woman by Roy Orbison, right? I make a recording of Pretty Woman. I could put it on my record. I could sell my record, right? That's no problem with that, right? And Roy Orbison, if my record makes money, ends up, his estate, of course, ends up getting royalties from it. But I don't have to ask Roy Orbison's estate permission to do that, right?
No. You don't.
So what if the AI is using Roy Orbison's stuff, and so they just put Roy Orbison as one of the songwriters on the song? Does the cover song sort of structure deal with that or not?
Yeah, it certainly can. I mean, this happens all the time. We're sticking with Olivia Rodrigo. After she released the song, she went back and gave a songwriting credit to Taylor Swift and Jack Antonoff because there were elements that she had reused. So, sampling, the whole business of
Yeah,
sampling in
so
hip
good.
hop.
Roger had asked about sampling, so that was my
Yeah,
second
right.
technical.
So
What's up?
there are structures that can do this, but you have to start from the premise that if I do that, then I ought to go ask and I ought to go pay. If you start from that premise, you can, I
Oh,
I mentioned that I participated in this copyright session, and I said ultimately these issues are going to get resolved in two rooms: courtrooms and conference rooms, right? And the legal pressures, in part, if was the question people asked earlier, why don't they just settle and pay up because it'll be cheaper than the litigation? That's the trade-off that people are going to make. If people believe they will have to pay ultimately, and infringements are expensive if you're found guilty of them, that may encourage them to work more with the labels and the artists, right? Not Google, YouTube, which of course is part of Google, has announced that they're going to be doing experimentation with estates of artists and others at Universal to figure out this model and what should the compensation be. And they announced, literally, I saw the news story this morning, that they're going to make it easier for the labels to, like they do with content ID, when things are uploaded with copyrighted material that belongs to the labels, to be able to make claims and say, we don't want this copy up there. We don't want this virtual synthetic voice of Taylor Swift to be available on YouTube. And YouTube says they're going to work with the labels and that kind of thing. So, there's an example where there are cooperative efforts going on. But, I think it's very much a balancing act between the legal risks and the technical.
I guess what I was getting
abilities.
at with the cover song example was that you don't have to ask permission.
Right.
There's a structure there where the artist gets compensated, but you don't have to ask permission. By the way, with sampling, like let's just say I was Vanilla Ice before he ripped off David Bowie, right? I mean, now is there a structure for sampling where you don't have to ask permission, or you have to ask permission to use a sample?
They typically do. There are sample libraries. There have been business models created because people are convinced they do need to do it, but in some cases they find it afterwards and then they settle up. Lawyers get involved and they settle up.
Yeah, I guess I was just kind of exploring what might be potential. Like the cover song example is an easy one. Everybody does it, right, uses it, and everybody makes out from it. Okay, so a couple other questions. So something maybe we talk about. So Joseph says, in the case of I think it was the first case of Olivia Rodrigo, where the student was in there, right? I mean, that was your example with the student, right? Wouldn't he or she be adding their own life experience and musical knowledge, to the song, whereas the AI would truly only have the Olivia Rodrigo songs to learn from? Isn't that a substantive difference, is the question?
Right. I think it is, but of course the AI could also be learning from the life experience of Taylor Swift at the same time they're redoing this.
That would be my answer as well. The AI would have the life experience of all the songwriters and in fact all manner of other stuff, because presumably what's being used right now is not trained only on songs.
Yeah, but one of the things you and I have talked about, Foster, and this gets to ultimately these are models that are predicting, and they're predicting based on what has come in the past, and there really isn't that much truly original stuff there. Yet the music or the writing that moves us has a creative aspect that is something more than just regurgitating what's come in the past. So, I think we both agreed we haven't yet seen any examples of here's a song that was written start to finish by an AI model that is as good as anything Lennon McCartney ever wrote. That just hasn't happened yet. Can it happen? perhaps, but
I'm going to
we're
be, I'm
certainly
going to
not there
go,
yet.
I'll tell them what you're referring to as well, but I'm going to go even much further than that is I've been looking, spending a lot of time looking, and I can't find anything that I would even deem to be good, let alone as good as something that Lennon and McCartney wrote. And I think what Howie was referring to is that what we've talked about, right, is this theory that I hold, and I think Howie does as well, which is, well, what are these large language models, right? These large language models are trained to essentially predict what someone would say, right? So they're not trained to basically write something original. They're trained to predict what someone would say. So that's a machine for creating triteness, right? And so but they're in a certain sense. That doesn't mean that they couldn't be used to do something creative. It doesn't. It just means like it's unlikely that if they're just used in their natural state, that they're going to tend to produce creative stuff. I mean, the jury's out as to whether some creative person figures out how to get them to do super creative things, right?
Yeah, and I think, again, one of the analogies that people make here is that, some artists are already saying they don't want to work with AI models. Others are saying, I'm already using it to generate ideas, whether it's for lyrics or melodic ideas. When auto-tune came out, right, there were people that said, well, I would never use auto-tune for my voice. And we have other artists who have built a burgeoning career on songs that are significantly auto-tuned, right? The last phase of Cher's career, we could pick out songs that have been heavily digitally manipulated, and is it really her voice anymore? So, these become tools, but she was the one doing that. She was doing it with her engineer, with her producer, and the involvement of that human being is different. I think these are phenomenal tools that we can find all kinds of great uses. We talked earlier about Discover Weekly as a playlist that's customized in terms of content for you, but it also could be customized to your individual musical taste. Maybe you like steel pedal guitar more than acoustic guitar. And wouldn't it be great to have one of the songs you really like take out the acoustic guitar and add a different instrument to it, because that's the kind of instrumentation you like. Again, that I'd really love to hear some different versions, of my favorite songs with different implementation, or I'd love to hear a new song sung by Linda Ronstadt, who unfortunately cannot perform anymore because of health issues. If she were willing to give permission to create that model, I'd love to hear some new stuff. But it all comes back to this, who is doing it and who is benefiting from it.
So on the do you know on the training data, I don't think we've talked about this, on the training data side, what is the state of the art of being able to with some reasonable confidence judge whether or not something was in the training data? I know people have been working on that on the research side. I think that as you mentioned, Google and some other companies would like to just get out ahead of it and basically be forget about this issue of having to identify it. Is there
there are a bunch of startups that are looking at this specific to the song use cases, the vocalist use cases. There is a lot of prior art on voice forensics. It hasn't been done for singing, though. It's, there are people that have built companies on distinguishing a real voice from a fake voice for a call center, right? I call in because I want to change the password on my Chase credit card kind of thing. And by the way, they're dealing with AI generated deep fakes as part of their training data sets. There's a testing protocol from the National Institute of Standards. There's one in Europe. So they have a long track record of trying to distinguish. Every 2 years, they do a big test of the models. And, now they're dealing with deep fake voice models for spoken word, right? And that's been something the labels have been worried about as well, or artists would be, right? If you're a very famous person and you say something that, that is contrary to your political beliefs. Taylor Swift has been influencing elections, they say, by telling people to go out and vote. If, you know, she supported a particular candidate in a voice fake, that would not be a good thing, right? So we're going to face that in the elections anyway. It's just that the doing the vocal timbre and tone, and that's just much more complex than simple speech.
One of my colleagues here, a year ago, was actually making voice fakes of me. And it was just crazy, like good. Had this I have a particular sort of cadence, and and it
Right.
had my voice okay, and it had that, and it even, I mean, so it would say other things, but it would say it in the kind of cadence that I would use. It's like,
Right.
sometimes it speaks up at meetings.
Yeah. Yeah. It says to the dean, "You flaming."
All right, Steve is a songwriter, and asked a question that's actually something else that we wanted to touch on. So I thought maybe now's a good time. Actually, it's 6:45, so we could we might move to questions, more questions anyway. But Steve was a songwriter, and says if he wanted to train a generative AI to automate functional music playing in dance clubs, background music, scene changes for TV, how would he get started?
Oh, well, there have been a bunch of companies that have done this already. Functional music. If you were a filmmaker at Tisch here at NYU, and you couldn't afford Hans Zimmer to compose the music for your student film, you could get functional music and pick the instrumentation, pick the beats. Here's this, I want spooky music with a cinematic feeling and glockenspiel. And there was one company, a startup here in New York called Amper Music, that basically built that platform. They didn't train on any copyrighted material. They recorded samples of thousands and thousands of instruments. They were actually bought by Shutterstock, right?
Yeah. I actually used Ampere back in 2000. I was working for Compass, the real estate tech giant. And to make put the music behind, we had AI created listing videos, and I was working with Ampere to try to see whether or not we could use it. It was absolutely remarkable what you could do. You could even set the points in time,
right,
when the intro would be over, when the music would climax, when the outro would start. It really made nice. Now, of course, it got bought, so you can't go to Ampere now, or
yeah.
maybe I don't know if it's still
I think there are others though that do the same thing.
So,
I'd have to go check my database, but that's the one that came to mind because I was familiar with them as well. And again, the functional music, and again, it sort of gets back to the example on the mastering side. There are lots of things where musicians and others want to create, it could be advertising copy, right? To look at a specific product, where I don't need to necessarily hire the best copywriter on Madison Avenue, but I could, write me something to go, advertise this particular drug or whatever. I think these functional uses are easier for the models to handle at first, because you weren't looking for great artistic music, right? You were just looking for something that hit those beats.
And I wanted because the reason for me was because we were going to, if we had gone this route, we were going to be generated tens of thousands of these things, and I wanted them to be different, because it's really really boring if you basically bought the rights to 50 tracks, but then they're the same tracks because people like a very small number of those 50 for this particular use, right? So by the way, just for Steve, I have not tried it myself, but take a look at Boomy, Boomy.
Boomy AI. Yes.
Boomy AI is they produce stuff that is in that realm that you're talking about. And I haven't tried it yet, but I have listened to some of the stuff that other people have made with it.
Yeah, that's one of the companies I should have remembered.
Let me just take a look through our.
So one thing, I can ask you a question, but I have to set it up a bit. Because as we mentioned earlier, that the Copyright Office solicited comments on all these issues.
Oh yeah.
And there were 9,000 responses to these issues. And when we were talking about getting ready for this talk, I said, I'm not going to read 9,000. submissions. They're from companies. Anthropic, that we mentioned, was the company that the labels had sued for lyrics, responded. Lots and lots of other companies responded. And I said, what I need is an artificial intelligence summary, generated summary of these 9,000 opinions. So what do you think of that idea, Foster?
Yeah, so we thank you very much to my colleague Jao Sadok. And if you haven't actually watched my fireside chat with Jao on interviewing the data science chatbot, you should go look for it on YouTube. And so Jao helped me out. So there's 9,000 comments, and these comments are actually long. Right. So there's even a question of what do you even do about it. But we had and I guess maybe Howie and I and Jao could write this write this up, and then I'll post it on LinkedIn or something if you're interested in learning what we did. But we had the ChatGPT summarize the comments and tell us what were the basic themes in the comments. And so it came up with 16 themes that looked something like this. So consent for use in AI training. There's unanimous agreement that I don't actually know. By the way, we don't know if these are correct. We didn't go through and check 9,000 comments to see if there really was unanimous agreement. This is what ChatGPT says. There's unanimous agreement that artist consent should be explicitly obtained for the use of their work in training AI models. In addition, there should be clear mechanisms for opting out, and creators must receive equitable compensation for their contributions. I'm pretty sure it's not unanimous, because I don't think Andreessen Horowitz would have agreed with that, right?
Right. I think among the people that favor artist rights, it's unanimous.
Protect creative integrity. The creative community seeks legal protection against AI's potential to dilute or replace human artistry, and ensuring sustainability for creators in their professional fields. Now, I think you noticed, I sent Howie 16 themes that actually were summarized by Chat GPT, and he said these are all actually essentially from the artist's perspective. These are all themes that are from the creator's perspective, no opposing views. And so we went back, and we asked ChatGPT to actually maybe look at these comments and give us some opposing views as well. And so it did, and it came up with I have to move my screen around to be able to see this. 12 on the other side, right? While many argue against the use of their work in AI training without consent, there's a viewpoint that AI could be empowering for artists. If artists could directly control and monetize their data for training AI, it could open up new revenue streams and opportunities for them, right? Which I hadn't realized is sort of in line with this notion that I have, that like once you have something like the cover version thing where people don't have to ask permission, yet the authors get some reasonable compensation, then that might actually be the best world or something like that, right? AI is a tool for augmentation, not replacement. Some may posit that AI should be viewed as a tool that augments creator rather than replacing it, and so on, right? And so I actually would say that is something that, you want to make sure that when I like this as a other side of the coin, right? Because you want to make sure that in helping out with all of the things that are on the creative side, you don't actually quash opportunities that they're not focusing on right now because they're scared of being, sort of having their jobs be eliminated or their livelihood being eliminated.
So one could argue that we displaced some paralegals, right, that might have done this work of reading the 9,000 and summarizing the key points. But on the other hand, you did this a lot more quickly than a paralegal could have, read 9,000 documents, some of which were 40 to 100 pages long.
Yeah. I think it would be an interesting research project to actually now go in and see how well the Chat GPT did. And I think one of the really interesting things is this, it's like, I'm not going to read the 9,000. You're not going to read the 9,000. I think you said that maybe even people at the Copyright Office don't want to read all 9,000 of them. They have to because that's their job, but don't necessarily want to, right? And so if you're not going to read them, would a slightly inaccurate version of the summary be better than nothing? Anyway, this
We
discussion is
digress.
getting beyond AI and the for the
Right.
creative professions.
But there is one question I think that is worth talking about. This was Victoria asked about, well, isn't it unrealistic because these models didn't just train on Olivia Rodrigo, they trained on all songs in the database. And asking them to keep track of all that seems like it's way too much work. And, I on the one hand, I agree with that. On the other hand, what that says is, well, we decided to do this in such a way that it was so complicated that you can't ask us to figure out who ought to get paid. And that was an engineering choice that they made and not, an organic result. So, if you build something that's so complicated, you can't figure out who to pay, that may be as much of your choice when you built this thing as it is,
well, I might take
solution.
Andreessen Horowitz's perspective on that one, though, right? They
Right.
built it with the notion that they didn't have to pay anybody, which is not
Yeah.
necessarily wrong, right?
Except that any lawyer they brought in the room would say, if you're going to go with a fair use defense, it always is on a case by case basis. You cannot rely on what has come before. It's fact specific. It's a defense to copyright infringement. And you would be foolish to rely on the Google Books case or the Andy Warhol case and say, this is a perfect fit for us. I don't think it's a coincidence that many of the comments on the we didn't need to ask say this is a quote quintessential fair use argument, because they want it to be a quintessential argument. The problem is there is no such thing as a quintessential fair use argument. There's always a specific argument that has to be made.
The fair use, right? Again, maybe I didn't, maybe this isn't clear to me, right? If I trained on the data and I am not actually producing something that clearly includes any piece of the copyrighted work, is the fact that I trained on it, I mean, is there still an argument that it would infringe on the creator's copyright?
It might fail the transformative test, but this gets back to the issue of, is it undermining the market? Is there a market impact or a potential market impact on what I do? And this is exactly why it's going to take lawyers and court cases in years to sort this stuff out.
Yeah, but they could also just get rid of all the songs and retrain.
Yeah, they could, but they don't want to do that.
Say, hey, you want your song out? Let us know.
Yeah,
we'll give you the
well, it's interesting that many of the people, and it comes out in these comments, say going forward we'll let you opt out. But of course, what do you do about all the other stuff that came before that wasn't opted out because they weren't aware that it was being trained on their works or their face or their voice?
Right. So Tyler has a question. AI has the potential to vastly reduce the technical barriers to entry for creating art of many forms. What are your thoughts on the potential for the future of artists' roles to be more of a curator across a medium of art to convey a specific feeling or emotion more precisely to align with their expressive desires, creating closer connections to the fans?
That could happen. We already have it where, many artists who get successful then, decide which other artists to boost up and promote and work with and write songs with and all those kinds of things. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing an awful lot of pressure on the digital service providers to change how they pay out in their share of revenues, because it is already the case that we have more than 100,000 songs a day being added to these services, and that can get to be an exponentially larger number when AI generated songs are around. It's not surprising that the companies that want to ensure they get payment for their artists are worried that this is going to get flooded with content. It is already the case 40% of the songs on Spotify don't get listened to.
Right. But you also could argue that, wait a minute, the problem isn't, I mean, oh my God, if we had more songs, we're going to have the problem may not be, 100,000 songs, 120,000, I think you told me, songs a day getting put up on Spotify already. It's like, it doesn't seem to be like, having 40 million songs a year, is maybe having all that much of a dilutive effect. It's not like my music all of a sudden is all this random stuff that, that's in that long tail.
Yeah, but it is some of the reason why I think there's so much attention being paid to this issue right now.
So I noticed the time. And our time is up. This is fantastic. Thanks so much, Howie, for being here. And I'm sure we could just talk all night.
Right, it was a lot of fun.
Okay, all right. Thanks everyone for joining. And if you have other people who you think might be interested in this, we will put we will put the recording up on YouTube along with the other Demystifying AI chats. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your evening.